The first chapter. The projected energy quotas of the Yolopile will rise significantly in the new quarter. Feed the machine, people. Message from the Yolopile's chief engineer. The artificial sun was only lit during holidays and state-sponsored events. It was far too costly, energy-wise, to waste on a district such as Privy. Instead, the eternal night of the enclosed megacity was illuminated by a forest of street lamps, obnoxious neon advertising, and the unblinking headlights of the endless caravans of ground vehicles. In the overhead of this metropolis, where any terrestrial would expect a sky to be, there was a myriad of piping and cables hidden by the darkness that swallowed the ceiling of the entire city. This infrastructure belonged to the city stacked on top of it, as Privy was stacked upon another, a pattern that continued in all directions until it reached some number, one which may have been countless. Few that lived within the districts could give a rational estimate of just how many city platters there were. Still, how many there would eventually be. Many, many Earths, and those other planets humans had colonized, were used to fill these massive cities. Each planet would populate an entire district, with any leftovers sorting themselves out. Naturally, the families would be kept together, and of course any arbitrary social groups they divided into. It was this bit of tribalism that made them easier to control, by keeping them small and adjacent to those that they had hated when they were terrestrials. They would evenly spread their hatred amongst the ethnic groups still intact, the rich and privileged, of course, as well as those children charged with keeping order, the risk eaters and law enforcement. With the trials brought about by daily life, the Yolopile and her captain were mostly forgotten. Unsurprisingly, it was one's neighbors that seemed to cause the most irritations. The gang members, the local police force, and the seemingly irrational rebels that fought against the both of them. But one only had to look up from the bloodied streets to see who it was that owned this boot in their throats. To be but a sniveling toady of one of the four families would bestow more power than the presidency of lesser nations on earth. And the princes. It was they who controlled the banks, and with it, the money, or those that desired to be attached to it. Few failed to charge the captain, Antonio Elias Meehan II, deicide, the God-Eater, with any of the atrocities and hardships within the districts. Though it was his hand, through direct contact in the beginning, or with a wave presently, that had imprisoned the refugees here. With an able propaganda master, any slight, it seemed, could be forgotten. Even a slight which put their city in darkness, just a little past noon, but it would appear to be midnight to any planet dweller. The illuminated windows of office buildings displayed white-collar workers with sloppily rolled sleeves and crumpled brows, delusional about their actual value. These were the lowliest of the pretenders, peoples whose monthly salaries were spent before payday. Everything in their possession was owned by another, but in truth, no one in the districts actually owned anything. Even the elite who were charged with the doling out. Only citizens of the Yolopile owned things. Everyone else remained the stewards of borrowed property. Her citizens, children of the Yolopile, looked upon money and those things bought with it as dirty things, imaginary things, objects with manufactured values. A cycle of energy was worth exactly who it was for. An empty space's worth would continue to fall as the ship expanded, and she was always expanding. Prime real estate. What was it that was rare beneath their feet? What could not be copied by the vestige and the seal? And yet everything was scarce in the districts, except maybe the suffering. The masses would shrug at the revelation. There was no freedom if there was nowhere to go, nowhere to be. And all in the districts understood as well as any wizened Yolopile philosopher that no one could be free. Not now. Not even the captain. Especially the captain. Trapped between these strange social contracts and shared lies were third parties. Men that helped direct the river of currency, made sure the face of the world looked the same no matter whomever, or whatever time they happened to have been a part of. Different from their privileged brothers and sisters, the look in the eye was missing. Listless it was. Eyes that had grown tired of being angry. Disinterested with any of the new sights they happened to fall upon. It was said that one of the coated men could walk into any skin joint and see nothing but his target, not the fortunately placed fat deposits wiggling, or the methodically placed orbs sitting still upon the chest. This ability to tune out the world did not make them the best bodyguards, hunters of those amongst the common that drew ire. Dyer seldom dealt with people outside of his class circle, unless there were outstanding debts to be collected, or the rebels had extended their reach beyond the ruined towers and the abandoned subway tunnels they occupied. His bullets would more than likely find the hearts and minds of those who had lived around the neighborhood he grew up in. This did nothing to ease his increasing standing within his local chapter. He had earned his coat easily enough. Mostly luck, really. Not as if he could have dodged the bullets shot his way, but being left unscathed, especially after so many others had fallen, allowed Dyer to stand a few inches taller, and a little money in his pockets forced his interest in the capitalism of the districts, another birth of a cynical disciple of the streets. And if the money flowed up, then the blood ran down, any of whom that was felled, a lesser, unworthy of love or dividends. Mercy was only extended to those civilians trapped unwillingly in the God-Eater's game, those who had created their own misery. Gamblers, druggies, and hustlers were allowed to drown themselves in the burning sweetness of excess, as long as they could afford to pay, and few could for very long. In quiet pairs or sometimes in packs they would emerge from dark cabs and fly into offices and apartment buildings, tearing bloodied prey away from borrowed fantasies, where he was forced to settle affairs with whatever street lord he was indebted to. Donning the coat enabled Dyer and his younger sibling to at least escape the stifling peonage that was happening within the districts. Those on the bottom of this pyramid were constantly fed inspiring media to encourage them to think if they just spun the wheel faster, they could strike free from the class they were born to. True, there existed a few ways to improve one's standard of living, but most involved leading a life constantly surrounded by violence and relentless persecution of the groups just beneath. Few possessed the heart and nerve to extract coin by force, especially when retribution came so swiftly. Of course, everyone cheated a little, where they could anyway, and in Dyer's occupation, which mainly consisted of collecting, one had to, with one hand tucked into his coat, surely gripped on a pistol, and the other hand out and open in front of him to accept payment. Always just a little more than required to line his own pockets. How else would he be paid? No matter how many streams the river broke into, the money always flowed up. But it must have ended with the super-rich that resided in the districts. And like their superior cousins on board the Yolopile, what use would they have for money? What did they do with it all? Dyer wondered. He hardly would be surprised to find out they burned it all in giant incinerators. Dyer allowed his head to fall back against the seat in the darkness of the cab. In front of him was a square-headed driver, a man that may as well have been a two-dimensional object to him, as he only ever saw the back of his square head and his squinted, mustard-yellow eyes in the rearview mirror. Dyer took a deep breath and sucked in the new smell of the cab. The cabs they used were always outstandingly clean, especially considering what happened in the back seats and trunks of many of them. The driver never complained when a mark vomited on the backs of their seats or pissed on the leather. Perhaps somewhere, Dyer thought, there was some big machine that printed out new taxicabs every time another was needed. He had never seen a manufacturing district, besides a few films in school. Supposedly there were good jobs there, but he had never met anyone that worked in one. He remembered the men and women looking so happy to be working, but he enjoyed working in the hours he chose. And in the street he could collect as much as he needed. Maybe his hustlers needed a new set of armored doors, some rapid-fire tools, perhaps some cufflinks for himself if he felt fancy. His father had been a test pilot for the Somnus Engineering Corps. Everyone that worked with the SEC did a majority of their work asleep. What his father did was test the stability of virtual worlds and provided feedback for the engineers' projects. Few people could bear with a constant strain on the psyche. Those that could tolerate living inside multiple realities were rewarded with dementia and an acute form of dyslexia membra, an ailment which affected its victim's ability to process sequence.